The little daughter of the housekeeper touched the scar on the businessman's face, and he froze upon hearing what she said. Subscribe to the channel and comment where you are watching from. The winter in New York City arrived early that year in 2024, painting the city in grey tones that seemed to mirror the mood of its inhabitants. The streets of the Upper East Side, where the most luxurious buildings of the city stood, were covered by a thin layer of frost that made pedestrians hurry towards the warmth of their destinations. Sarah Johnson adjusted her daughter's pink scarf for the third time that morning while they waited for the elevator of the Royal Heights building. At 28 years old, she carried a responsibility that seemed greater than her delicate frame could bear. Her brown hair was tied up in a practical bun, and her hands, marked by small knife cuts and stove burns, revealed her 3 years as a private chef. The impeccable navy blue uniform contrasted with the nervousness that shone in her green eyes. "Mommy, why are you nervous?" asked Emily, her 6-year-old daughter, tugging at the hem of her mother's coat. The girl had the same green eyes as her mother, but with a sparkle of curiosity that seemed to capture every detail of the world around her. Her curly blonde hair escaped from her wool hat, forming small, rebellious curls that danced with every movement of her head. "I'm not nervous, my love. It's just that today is special. You're going to see where Mommy works." Sarah knelt to her daughter's height, adjusting the pink coat that covered her school uniform. "Remember what we talked about Mr. Edwards? That he is very rich and doesn't like to talk much," Emily replied, swinging her legs. As she spoke, "and that he has a mark on his face, but that doesn't mean he is bad. You said that a mark on the face is like a mark on the knee when I fall off my bike, just bigger." The elevator arrived with a soft ding, and mother and daughter stepped into the mirrored cabin that would take them to the 32nd floor. Sarah watched her reflection multiply and sighed. 3 months ago, Emily's school had changed its schedule due to renovations in the building, and she no longer had anyone to leave the girl with in the mornings. Grandma Betty, her 67-year-old adoptive mother, was going through a tough time with heart problems and could not take care of her granddaughter as before. "Does Mr. Edwards live in the clouds, Mummy?" Emily pressed her face against the elevator glass, watching the city get smaller below. "Almost, Princess. He lives very high up, in a very big and beautiful apartment." The elevator stopped smoothly on the top floor of the building. The doors opened, revealing a private lobby decorated with Carrara marble and an abstract painting of impressive proportions. Sarah took a deep breath, held her daughter's hand tightly, and rang the bell. Mr. Edwards was in his study, reviewing financial reports when he heard the sound. At 45 years old, he was of average height, but compensated for any lack of physical presence with a magnetic aura that made any room feel smaller when he entered. His grey hair was always perfectly styled, and his tailored suits had no wrinkles out of place, but it was the scar that drew the most attention. An irregular mark that began at his left temple, cut through part of his cheek, and ended near the corner of his mouth, as if someone had drawn a lightning bolt on his skin. 27 years had passed since the accident, but he still avoided mirrors whenever possible. "Sarah is here," he murmured to himself, checking the Rolex on his wrist. She was always punctual. In 3 years of work, she had never been late a single time, had not questioned his exotic food preferences, and had not tried to make unnecessary small talk. She was exactly the type of employee he preferred, efficient, discreet, and respectful of his need for solitude. He walked to the door, adjusting the left side of his face into a position that minimized the visibility of the scar, an automatic gesture he performed thousands of times a day. Upon opening the door, he found Sarah accompanied by a small girl who was watching him with the intensity of a scientist studying a new species. "Good morning, Mr. Edwards. This is my daughter, Emily." Sarah gave a slight nod. "As we discussed yesterday, she will be with me only during the mornings this week." "Good morning," he replied dryly, maintaining his usual professional tone. His eyes met the girl's for a brief second before he looked away. "The rules remain the same. Absolute silence during my meetings and—" Mr. Edwards could not finish the sentence. Emily had let go of her mother's hand and walked directly toward him. Without hesitation, without fear, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, she extended her small hand and gently touched his scar. The world stopped. Mr. Edwards felt as if he had received an electric shock that coursed through his entire body. For 27 years, only doctors and nurses had touched that mark. No one else, not his ex-wife, not casual girlfriends, not even his mother. The scar was forbidden territory, the physical proof of his difference, of his inadequacy. "Emily!" Sarah shouted, horrified. She stepped forward to pull her daughter back, her face red with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, Mr. Edwards. She didn't mean to—" But Mr. Edwards couldn't move. The girl's green eyes studied him with pure curiosity, devoid of any trace of disgust or pity. And then, in a voice as sweet as honey, she whispered, "Mommy says that scars are the places where angels kiss us to make us stronger." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah was paralyzed, waiting for the explosion of anger that would surely come. Mr. Edwards, on his part, he felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. For the first time in decades, someone had touched his scar without disgust, without pity, without embarrassment. And more than that, the girl had spoken about it as if it were something beautiful. "Emily, come here right now," Sarah whispered, extending her hand urgently. "Mr. Edwards, I sincerely apologize. This won't happen again, I promise." Edwards blinked several times, as if waking from a deep dream. He looked at Sarah, then at Emily, who continued to smile at him as if she had just made a new friend. No problem," he managed to say, his voice rougher than usual. I have work to do, important calls to make." He turned abruptly and walked toward the study, shutting the door with more force than necessary. On the other side, he leaned against the wood and brought his hand to the scar, exactly where Emily's small fingers had touched. For the first time in 27 years, Edward Vasconcelos cried. 2 weeks had passed since the episode at the door, and Edward discovered that his morning routine had been completely altered by something he had never imagined possible, genuine curiosity about another person. Every morning, when he heard the elevator arrive at the 32nd floor, he strategically positioned himself in the dining room, where he could observe the entrance without being noticed. Edward's penthouse occupied the entire top floor of the building, with a panoramic view of New York City that extended to the distant hills. The space was decorated with Italian designer furniture, contemporary artworks, and a library that occupied an entire wall of the main living area. Each object had been carefully chosen by renowned decorators, creating an impeccable space, but as cold as a museum. Sarah maintained her impeccable professional demeanor, greeting him politely every morning and heading straight to the gourmet kitchen, where she prepared his meals with the precision of an experienced chef. Emily, on the other hand, sat at the smaller dining table near the kitchen, where she quietly did her schoolwork or drew. On that July Thursday, Edward pretended to read the Financial Times while watching the girl. She had spread colored pencils across the table and was working intently on a drawing that seemed very elaborate for a 6-year-old. Her blonde hair fell over the paper like a golden curtain, and she lightly bit her tongue as she focused on the details. "Sweetheart, don't forget to put the pencils away afterward," Sarah called from the kitchen, not stopping her chopping of onions for the risotto that Edward had requested for lunch. "Okay, Mom," Emily replied, lifting her head. It was then that her eyes met Edward's through the Venetian mirror positioned on the side wall. Instead of looking away, she smiled and waved discreetly. Edward felt his heart race. He returned the wave almost imperceptibly and went back to pretending to read the newspaper, but his attention was completely captured by the girl, who had resumed her drawing with even more dedication. "Sarah," he called, folding the newspaper with military precision, "I need to leave early today. Meeting with Japanese investors at 2 in the afternoon." "Of course, Mr. Edwards. Lunch will be ready at 11:30, she replied, seasoning the risotto with fresh basil. "Emily and I will leave right after you do." Edward stood up and walked toward the office, but paused as he passed the table where Emily was drawing. Not wanting to seem too interested, he took a discreet glance at the paper and was shocked by what he saw. The drawing depicted the living room of the penthouse with an impressive level of detail. She had reproduced the Roche-Beaubois sofa, the glass coffee table, even the ornamental plants in the Italian ceramic pots. But what surprised him the most was seeing that she had drawn 3 figures in the room: a brown-haired woman working in the kitchen, a man in a suit reading a newspaper, and a small girl drawing at the table. The perfect family he had never had. You draw very well," he said, unable to hide the admiration in his voice. Emily stopped coloring and looked at him with her bright green eyes. "Thank you. Mum says I have an artist's eye. Do you want to see my other drawings?" Before Edward could respond, she was already flipping through a notebook full of illustrations. There were drawings of school, the house they lived in, Grandma Betty knitting in the armchair, and to his surprise, several portraits of him. In all of them, she had drawn him smiling without emphasizing the scar. "This one is you reading," she said, pointing to a drawing where he appeared sitting in the leather armchair with a book in his hands. "And this is you having coffee. You always have coffee without sugar, right? Just like my grandma." Edward was stunned. The girl had observed and memorized details about him that he himself didn't even pay attention to. Do you watch me a lot?" "A little bit," Emily shrugged, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Mum said you like to be alone, so I don't bother you. But I think you look sad when you're alone. That's why I draw." "You smiling?" The sincerity in the girl's voice hit Edward like a punch to the stomach. He looked at Sarah, who had stopped cooking and was watching them with an unreadable expression on her face. "Emily, don't bother Mr. Edwards," Sarah said gently, approaching the table. "He has important work to do." "She's not bothering me," Edward replied quickly, surprised by his own words. "It's just that I've never seen a child draw with such precision." Sarah came closer and looked at the drawings, a proud smile forming on her lips. "She's always been like this. Since she was little, she can remember details that we don't even notice. The school teacher said she has a very good memory." "Special photographic memory?" Mr. Edwards asked, his analytical mind already processing the implications. "Something like that. She has some difficulties with letters, but with numbers and images—" Sarah gently ran her hand through her daughter's hair. "It's as if she photographs everything in her mind." Mr. Edwards looked again at the drawings, now with a different perspective. The precision was not just artistic talent, it was a rare cognitive ability. "And how does she adapt at school?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, exchanging a quick glance with her daughter. "Well, sometimes it's difficult. Emily is very smart, but she learns differently from other kids." "How so?" Mr. Edwards insisted, genuinely interested. "The letters get a bit scrambled in my head," Emily explained casually, "but I can remember everything I see, just like a camera. Mum says my brain works in a special way." Mr. Edwards felt a tightness in his chest. He was well acquainted with the feeling of being different, of not fitting into expected norms. "Does that bother you?" "Sometimes," Emily admitted, returning to color her drawing. "But Mum says being different can be a superpower if we know how to use it right." Mr. Edwards looked at Sarah with newfound respect. She was raising that special girl with a wisdom and sensitivity he rarely saw, even among people with much more resources. "Mr. Edwards," Sarah said, returning to the kitchen, "about tomorrow. Emily's school is having a parent meeting in the afternoon. Would it be possible for me to leave a bit early?" "Of course," he replied immediately. "In fact, take as much time as you need. Family matters are important." Sarah looked at him in surprise. In 3 years of working together, she had never seen him show interest in personal matters of employees. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards. Thank you very much." Mr. Edwards waved briefly and headed to the office, but before closing the door, he stopped again. "Emily?" "Yes?" You can draw here in the living room if you want. The dining table has more space and the light is better." The smile she gave him in response was worth more than any $1 million deal he had ever closed. The month of August brought a subtle, yet significant change in the dynamics of the apartment. Mr. Edwards began leaving forgotten books on the larger dining table, volumes of art, geography, and illustrated history that seemed to have been abandoned by chance, but were actually carefully selected to spark Emily's curiosity. That Tuesday morning, he discreetly watched as the girl flipped through a book about French Impressionism. Her small fingers traced the pages with reverence, stopping at each image as if it were a discovered treasure. "Mum, come see!" Emily called, pointing to a reproduction of Monet's Water Lilies. "This painting looks like the pond in the park where we go." Sarah approached, drying her hands on her apron. Upon seeing the artwork, her eyes lit up in a way Mr. Edwards had never witnessed before. "It's Claude Monet, my love. He painted the light reflecting on the water. See how each brushstroke seems to capture a different moment." Mr. Edwards stopped pretending to read his emails and gave his full attention to the conversation. There was something in Sarah's voice, a contained passion, a knowledge that went far beyond what he would expect from a cook. "Did he paint the same lake several times?" Emily asked, flipping through the pages, to compare different versions of the water lilies. "Yes, because he wanted to show how the light changes throughout the day," Sarah explained, sitting next to her daughter. "In the morning, the light is golden. In the afternoon, more bluish. And at the end of the day, somewhat reddish. Every hour, the same place becomes a completely new place." Mr. Edwards was fascinated not only by Sarah's knowledge, but by how she could explain complex concepts in a way a 6-year-old could understand. He discreetly stood up and approached the table. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, trying to sound casual, "but I couldn't help but overhear your explanation about Monet. Very precise." Sarah blushed slightly. "Oh, I've always liked art. It's just a hobby." "What kind of hobby?" Mr. Edwards insisted, genuinely curious. "Before I had Emily, I studied art history at the University of California, Santa Barbara," Sarah replied, lowering her gaze. "I intended to specialize in contemporary American art." Mr. Edwards felt as if he had discovered a hidden diamond in his own home. "And why did you stop?" Sarah exchanged a quick glance with Emily, who had returned her focus to the book. "Life changed the plans. Sometimes priorities shift, right?" There was a story there, Mr. Edwards knew, a story of interrupted dreams that he recognized in his own journey. He looked at Emily, then at Sarah, and an idea began to form in his mind. "Sarah, have you seen my private collection?" She looked at him, confused. "Collection, sir?" "In the office. I have some interesting pieces. Maybe you'd like to take a look since you understand the subject." Sarah hesitated. In 3 years of working together, she had never entered Mr. Edwards' private office. It was sacred territory, where he only received important clients and conducted the most confidential business. "I don't want to intrude." "It's not an intrusion," Mr. Edwards interrupted. "In fact, I would like a second opinion on some pieces." They walked to the office with Emily curiously following behind. The environment was imposing, mahogany bookshelves filled with books on economics and philosophy, a mahogany desk that seemed to have been carved by master artisans, and on the walls. Sarah held her breath. There were 3 canvases she recognized immediately: an O'Keeffe from the social phase, a Rivera depicting women at a summer festival, and what appeared to be an original Calder with its characteristic flags. "My God," she whispered, approaching the O'Keeffe canvas. "This is from the Migrants series, isn't it? From 1944. Mr. Edwards was impressed. "Exactly. Most experts I have here take at least 5 minutes to identify the work and the period." Sarah studied. She examined the painting with the eyes of a connoisseur, analyzing the technique, colors, and composition. The expression of pain and hope at the same time. O'Keeffe managed to capture the soul of the American people in a unique way, and this Calder. She moved to the next canvas. The use of yellow and red to represent joy amidst simplicity. It's masterful. Mr. Edwards watched Sarah with growing fascination. She was not just impressed with the value of the works. She was genuinely moved by the art itself. Her eyes sparkled just like Emily's when she discovered something new. "And you, how did you acquire these pieces?" Sarah asked, then quickly corrected herself. "Sorry, it's none of my business." "Family inheritance," Mr. Edwards replied. "My grandfather was a collector. I always thought they were beautiful, but I confess I didn't understand much of the historical significance until now." Emily, meanwhile, had discovered a small bronze sculpture on a side table and was observing it with intense focus. "This man looks sad," she commented. Sarah approached her daughter and smiled. "It's a work by Calder, my love, a very famous artist from California many years ago." Mr. Edwards was shocked. "How did you know? Most people don't recognize smaller pieces by Calder." "The hands," Sarah explained, pointing to the details of the sculpture. "The way he sculpted the hands was unique. And look at the facial expression, melancholy mixed with faith. It's very characteristic of his final phase." Mr. Edwards sat down in the leather armchair behind the table, processing what he had just discovered. For 3 years, he had treated Sarah like an ordinary employee, when in fact he had an art specialist working in his kitchen. "Sarah," he said slowly, "why have you never mentioned your knowledge of art?" She shrugged, still admiring the sculpture. "You never asked. Besides, I'm your cook, not your curator." "But you could be," Mr. Edwards said impulsively, then stopped, surprised by his own words. Sarah looked at him, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Mr. Edwards hesitated, feeling like he was treading on unfamiliar territory. "It's just that I have many clients here, investors, business partners. Many of them are collectors too, or at least like to pretend they know about art. Sometimes I feel lost in conversations about it." "Are you offering—" "Nothing formal," Mr. Edwards hurried to say, "just thinking that maybe, if you were interested, you could give me some occasional guidance. Of course, it would be compensated separately." Sarah looked at Emily, who had sat on the floor and started drawing the Calder sculpture with impressive precision. I need to think. It's an incredible opportunity, but—" "Mom," Emily interrupted, not stopping her drawing. "You always say that when we receive a gift, we should be grateful and accept it with our hearts." Mr. Edwards involuntarily smiled. The wisdom of that girl was disarming. "She's right," Sarah admitted, a shy smile forming on her lips. Maybe we can talk about the details later." At that moment, Mr. Edwards realized that his organized and predictable life was about to become much more complicated. And for the first time in years, that didn't scare him. September arrived with the characteristic excitement of spring in New York City, but it also brought a pressure that Mr. Edwards knew all too well, the family insistence on his matrimonial future. That Thursday, he was in his office reviewing contracts when the intercom rang with the irritating insistence that only his mother could impart to a simple call. "Eduardo, dear," Mrs. Albertson's voice echoed through the sound system with all her aristocratic authority. "I need to speak with you urgently. I'm coming up." Mr. Edwards sighed heavily, knowing exactly what the conversation would be about. At 72, Mrs. Albertson still commanded social events of the New York elite with an iron fist and a matrimonial agenda for her son that rivaled the best dating websites. A few minutes later, she entered the penthouse like an elegant hurricane, dressed entirely in Chanel and emanating the French perfume she had worn for decades. Her grey hair was impeccably styled, and her blue eyes, identical to Mr. Edwards, carried that determination he had known since childhood. "Good morning, Mrs. Albertson," Sarah greeted respectfully from the kitchen, where she was preparing a cheese soufflé. "Oh, Sarah, dear! As always impeccable," Mrs. Albertson replied, with the politically correct smile she reserved for employees. Then, lowering her voice, as if sharing a state secret, "Where is that adorable child you brought a few times?" "Emily is at school, Ma'am. She only comes in the mornings when there are issues with the schedule." Mr. Edwards watched the interaction with discomfort. There was something condescending in the way his mother spoke about Emily, as if the girl were a cute pet, but temporary. "Mum," he interrupted, "let's go to the office. I have a meeting in an hour." "Perfect. It's exactly about meetings that I need to talk to you," Mrs. Albertson said, following her son. As soon as the doctor closed, she got straight to the point. "Claudia Anderson arrived from Paris yesterday. Her father is eager to finalize our business partnership, and you know this depends on your marriage." Mr. Edwards poured himself a whiskey at 10 in the morning and leaned against the table. "Mum, we've talked about this. I'm not going to marry for convenience." "Convenience?" Mrs. Albertson laughed disdainfully. "Eduardo, you're 45 years old. Claudia is beautiful, well-educated, from a great family. What more do you want? Love, perhaps? Compatibility? The feeling that I'm not buying a wife?" Mrs. Albertson studied her son with an analytical gaze. "You've changed, Eduardo. There's something different about you in the last few weeks. You're more, I don't know, more human." Mr. Edwards nearly choked on his whiskey. "Thank you for the maternal vote of confidence." "It wasn't a criticism, it was an observation. And I'm worried. I hope you're not developing some inappropriate fantasy about the people who work here." Mr. Edwards's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" "Oh, please, Eduardo. I'm your mother. I know your behavioral patterns better than anyone. You've been different since that—" The cook started bringing her daughter. "More observant, more present." Mr. Edwards abruptly stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the city. "Sarah is an exemplary employee, and Emily is just a child who has affected you in some way," Mrs. Albertson completed, approaching her son. "Eduardo, I understand. You've always had a soft spot for children. Remember when you adopted that stray dog? Or when you wanted to bring home the boy who sold candy at the traffic light?" Eduardo remembered. He also recalled how those compassionate impulses were always quickly stifled by the reality his family imposed. "But you need to be practical," Mrs. Albertson continued. "Claudia can give you legitimate children, a real family, not these temporary arrangements with employees." "Mom," Eduardo began, but was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. "Mr. Edwards?" It was Sarah's voice. "Sorry to bother you, but I just received a call from the school. Emily got sick and I need to pick her up." Eduardo opened the door immediately. Sarah looked pale, her hands trembling slightly. What do you mean she got sick? Did something happen? They said she had an anxiety attack during gym class. She started crying and said she couldn't breathe. Sarah's voice was laden with concern. This has never happened before. I don't understand. Go get her, Eduardo said without hesitation. Take my car. Angelo is in the garage. He can take you both to the doctor if necessary. Sarah looked at him in surprise. Mr. Edwards, I can't. Yes, you can. It's an emergency. He grabbed the keys to the BMW from the keychain. And Sarah, call me if you need anything. Anything at all. After Sarah left, Mrs. Albertson watched her son with an expression that mixed understanding and concern. You're in love with her, she said simply. Eduardo didn't respond, but his silence was answer enough. Eduardo, son... Mrs. Albertson sighed deeply. I understand the attraction. She's beautiful, has natural class, but think about the complications, the social difference, the gossip, the impact on the business. What if I don't care about any of that? Eduardo asked, still looking out the window. Then you will destroy everything we've built, the company, our social standing, your future. Mrs. Albertson paused. And you'll destroy their lives too. Do you really believe a woman like Sarah would be happy being judged as the cook who seduced the millionaire boss? Eduardo closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his mother's words. Mrs. Albertson always knew exactly where to aim to cause the most damage. Claudia is waiting for you for dinner tonight at Le Bernardin. 8 o'clock, she said, heading for the door. Eduardo, you've always been too smart to let your heart make important decisions. After she left, Eduardo was left alone with his thoughts and a glass of whiskey that had lost all its taste. He picked up his phone several times to call Sarah, but always backed out at the last moment. Around 3 in the afternoon, she returned with Emily. The girl looked paler than usual, clinging to her mother's hand as if afraid of being separated from her. How is she? Eduardo asked immediately. The doctor said it was indeed anxiety, Sarah replied, running her hand through her daughter's hair. Apparently, she got worried because a classmate mentioned that sometimes working mums get sick and have to go to the hospital. Eduardo looked at Emily, who was avoiding his gaze. And you were scared something would happen to your mom? The girl nodded shyly. Grandma Betty had to go to the hospital last month, and Julia from my class said that when a mum works far from home, sometimes she disappears. Eduardo's heart broke a little. That extraordinary child was carrying fears that no child should have. Emily, he said, crouching down to her level, your mum is the strongest and bravest person I know, and she will never ever disappear. Understood? How can you be sure? Emily asked, with that brutal honesty that only children possess. Eduardo hesitated, then looked at Sarah. Because I will make sure that never happens. I promise. It was the first promise Eduardo Edwards had ever made to a child. In his life, and as he watched the shy smile return to Emily's face, he knew he had just changed the course of everything. Dinner at Le Bernardin was a calculated disaster. Eduardo arrived promptly at 8 o'clock, found Claudia Anderson radiant in a red Valentino dress, and spent 2 hours pretending to be interested in a conversation that ranged from gossip about Parisian high society to plans for a honeymoon in the Maldives that he had never agreed to. Claudia was objectively perfect. At 32, she had the polished beauty of someone who frequented the best salons in Paris, spoke 4 languages fluently, and held an MBA from Sorbonne, exactly the type of woman his mother would approve of and what the family business required. Eduardo, darling, you seem distant, Claudia said, delicately touching his hand across the table. Her nails were perfectly polished in a nude shade, and the diamond ring she wore cost more than many people would earn in a lifetime. Are you still thinking about that merger with the Japanese? Something like that. Eduardo replied, watching how she cut the salmon into geometrically perfect pieces. Everything about Claudia was perfect, predictable, safe. So why could he only think about a 6-year-old girl with messy hair drawing angels on napkins? Dad is very eager to finalize our partnership, Claudia continued, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. He said that as soon as we announce our engagement, he can release the investments for the project in Upper East Side. Eduardo stopped chewing. Claudia, we never talked about engagement. Oh, but of course we did, she laughed, a crystal-clear sound that echoed through the elegant restaurant. Our parents have been talking about this for years. It's just a matter of formalizing it, isn't it? Eduardo studied Claudia more closely. There was something calculating about her demeanor. In her eyes, a coldness that he recognized because it was identical to his own. For a terrible moment, he saw himself reflected in her. Two beautiful, wealthy, and completely empty people planning a life together without a hint of genuine love. I need to go, he said abruptly, signaling to the waiter. Sarah! The dessert hasn't even arrived yet, Claudia protested, but he was already getting up. Emergency at work. You understand. On the way home, Mr. Edwards drove through the streets of New York City, trying to process what he had felt during dinner. It wasn't exactly anger, it was more like disgust with himself. Disgust for considering marrying someone he viewed as a business transaction. Disgust for almost accepting a life without true affection. When he arrived at the penthouse, it was almost midnight. He expected everything to be dark and silent. But there was a light on in the kitchen. His first reaction was irritation. Sarah should have left hours ago. But as he approached, he discovered a scene that made him stop in his tracks. Sarah was sitting at the kitchen counter, still wearing her navy blue uniform, but with her hair down, framing her face. She held a cup of tea and gazed out the window with a melancholic expression he had never seen before. There was no makeup covering the small, dark circles under her eyes, no professional smile. It was just Sarah, raw and real, and she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Sarah, he called softly. She jumped, almost spilling her cup. Mr. Edwards, I didn't know you were back. I'm sorry, I was just about to leave. You don't need to leave, he said, stepping closer. Did something happen? Why are you still here? Sarah hesitated, then sighed. Emily had another anxiety episode at bedtime. Grandma Betty wasn't feeling well enough to take care of her, so I brought her with me. She's sleeping in the guest room. I hope you don't mind. Of course I don't mind. Mr. Edwards poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter beside her. And you? Are you okay? Sarah gave a sad smile. Just tired. Sometimes I feel like I'm sailing through a storm without a compass, you know, trying to do my best for Emily, take care of Grandma Betty, keep up with work. And yet I feel like I'm failing at everything. Mr. Edwards looked at her in surprise. It was the first time Sarah had truly opened up to him, showing her vulnerability without the professional filters. You're not failing, he said with conviction. Emily is an extraordinary child, and that didn't happen by chance. Do you think so? Sarah looked at him with a longing that made Mr. Edwards's heart race. Sometimes I wonder if I'm being selfish, if I should have tried to give her a father, a complete family. A complete family doesn't necessarily mean a dad and a mom, Mr. Edwards said, surprising himself with his own words. It means love, security, people who genuinely care for each other. Sarah studied him for a long moment. How was your dinner? With Claudia, right? Mr. Edwards was shocked that she knew. How did you? Your mum mentioned it when she was here. She said she was a nice girl from a traditional family. Sarah looked down at her cup. She must be beautiful. She is, Mr. Edwards admitted, but his voice was strangely empty. Very beautiful, very polite, very perfect. But Mr. Edwards hesitated, knowing he was treading on dangerous ground. But when I talk to her, I feel like I'm talking to a mirror. She reflects exactly what I say, without adding anything new, without challenging me, without surprising me. Sarah smiled slightly. Sometimes people do that when they're nervous. They try to be what they think the other person wants. And you? Mr. Edwards asked impulsively. Do you do that with me? Sarah looked him directly in the eyes. No. With you, I am exactly who I am, for better or for worse. The silence that followed was charged with a tension that they both recognized, but none dared to name. Mr. Edwards moved a little closer, and for a terrible and wonderful moment he thought about kissing her. It was then that Emily appeared in the kitchen doorway, her hair tousled and holding a teddy bear. "Mommy, I had a bad dream." The spell was instantly broken. Sarah jumped off the counter and ran to her daughter, enveloping her in a protective hug. "What dream, my love?" "I dreamed that you were leaving and forgetting me." Emily sobbed against her mother's shoulder. Mr. Edwards watched mother and daughter comforting each other, and a wave of tenderness mixed with despair washed over him. He wanted to be part of that scene. He wanted the right to comfort them, to protect them. "Emily," he said softly, stepping closer, "can I tell you a secret?" The girl looked at him with red eyes from crying. "What secret?" "Your mom has a special memory. She could never forget you because you are kept right here." He touched his chest, over his heart, in the safest place there is. "How do you know?" Emily asked. Mr. Edwards looked at Sarah, then back at the girl. "Because that's how I feel about both of you." The words came out before he could censor them, too raw and honest. Sarah looked at him with an expression that mixed shock and something he couldn't identify. "I'm going to take Emily back to bed," Sarah finally said, her voice a little shaky. After they left, Mr. Edwards was alone in the kitchen, knowing he had just crossed a line from which there would be no return. Monday arrived with a tense atmosphere that seemed to hold its breath inside the penthouse. Sarah arrived at work 15 minutes late, something unprecedented in her 3 years of employment, and avoided Mr. Edwards' gaze during the entire morning greeting. Emily, for her part, was too quiet, drawing in silence at the dining table without asking her usual questions. Edward tried to maintain his normal routine, but he found it impossible to concentrate on financial reports when every fibre of his being was attuned to the slightest movements of Sarah Johnson around the house. The soft lavender perfume she wore seemed more intense, the sound of her footsteps in the kitchen more melodious, her presence more necessary. Around 10 o'clock, his phone rang. It was Dr. Henry Moore, the family lawyer and one of the few men Edward completely trusted. "Edward, I need to talk to you urgently." Henry's voice was tense. "It's about the investigation you asked me to do a few months ago." Edward was confused. "What investigation?" "About the staff. You said you wanted to check the backgrounds of everyone who works in your home." Edward vaguely remembered the request, made in a moment of paranoia after discovering that a former employee had tried to sell information about his routine to tabloids. And then, "I found something about Sarah Johnson. Edward, you need to sit down." Edward's blood ran cold. "What did you find?" "Her full name is Sarah Vasconcelos Johnson." "Vasconcelos, Edward. She carries your family name." Edward felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. "What are you saying?" "She is the biological daughter of Helen Johnson, who worked as your grandfather's personal secretary from 1993 to 1996. Helen got pregnant and was discreetly let go. Sarah was put up for adoption as a baby." Edward leaned against the table, trying to process the information. "Helen Johnson. I vaguely remember a secretary by that name, but If Sarah is adopted, she doesn't know, Edward. From the records I could access, Betty Johnson adopted Sarah when she was only 3 months old and never told the truth about her origins. And the biological father? Henry paused for too long. Edward, there is a letter in the company's files. Helen left a letter before she left, revealing who the father was. Who? Your grandfather, Anthony Johnson. Edward's world collapsed. Sarah was his aunt, half-sister to his father, and he was, oh my God, he was in love with his own aunt. Edward, are you there? I need to hang up, Edward managed to say before dropping the phone. He stood in the office for several minutes, trying to reorganize his entire perception of reality. Sarah was not just an employee he had fallen in love with. She was family. She was blood of his blood, working as a domestic worker in the house that should also be hers by right. A soft knock on the door brought him back to reality. Mr. Edward, it was Sarah's voice. Is everything okay? I heard a noise. Edward opened the door with trembling hands. Sarah was there, with those worried. Green eyes, completely unaware that her entire life had been built on a lie. Sarah, he began, then stopped. How to explain something like this? How to tell a 28-year-old woman that she was not who she thought she was? You look pale. Did something serious happen? Sarah stepped closer, and for a terrible moment, Edward wanted to embrace her. Not as a lovesick man, but as a nephew who had just found a lost aunt. Sarah, I need to tell you something. Can you sit down? She looked at him with growing concern, but sat in the leather armchair in front of the desk. Remember when you told me you were adopted? Yes, Betty was always very open about that. Why? Edward took a deep breath. I had some staff investigated a few months ago, security routine, and I found out who your biological parents are. Sarah turned very pale. I don't know if I want to know. Betty always said that if I wanted to search, she would help me, but I never wanted to. She is my real mom. I understand. But Sarah, this is important because it affects our situation here. How so? Edward stood up and walked to the window, unable to look at her while speaking. Your biological mother was named Helen Johnson. She worked for my grandfather in the 90s. The silence behind him was deafening. Sarah, you are my aunt, half-sister to my father. When he finally turned around, Sarah was as white as a sheet, her hands gripping the arms of the chair. This is impossible, she whispered. I wish it were. But I have all the documents. The letter your mother left before leaving the company, the adoption records. Sarah abruptly stood, up, swaying slightly. I need air. Edward stepped closer to support her, but she instinctively recoiled. No, don't touch me. Oh my God, Edward, I know. And Emily, my daughter, our daughter. Sarah covered her face with her hands. She is your cousin. She is part of the Johnson family. Yes. Sarah began to pace the office like a caged animal. 3 years, Edward. 3 years I worked as a maid in the house that should have been mine too. 3 years you treated me like a subordinate when we are family. Sarah, I didn't know, but you should have looked into it, she exploded, turning to him with tear-filled eyes. When you started to develop feelings, you should have investigated before putting me in this situation. Edward felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. She was right, absolutely right. You are right, he admitted. I was irresponsible. I'm so sorry. Sarah wiped her tears with the back of her hand. I need to get Emily and leave. No, Edward said quickly. Please, don't do that. Why not? How can I stay here knowing all of this? Edward hesitated. then decided on total honesty. Because you and Emily are the only real family I have. Because for 3 years you made this house a home in a way that no one else could. And because, he swallowed hard, because even knowing the truth, I still love you both. Not in the wrong way I thought before, but in the right way, as an uncle who wants to take care of her niece and great-niece, whom she found by chance. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, tears silently rolling down her cheeks. I need time to process all of this. Take as much time as you need. And I need to tell Emily she deserves to know that she has a bigger family. Of course. Sarah headed for the door, then stopped. Edward, the letter my mom left. Can I read it? Of course. Henry is bringing all the documents this afternoon. After she left, Edward sank into the armchair, knowing that his life had changed completely in a matter of minutes. He had lost the love of his life, but perhaps gained something even rarer, a real family. The October afternoon brought an almost palpable tension to the penthouse. Dr. Henry arrived promptly at 3 o'clock, carrying a leather briefcase full of documents that would rewrite the history of 2 families. Edward welcomed him into the office, where Sarah was already waiting, sitting rigidly in the armchair, with Emily beside her silently drawing. The girl felt the gravity of the moment, even without fully understanding. Sarah, Henry said gently, I know this must be very difficult for you. If you want, I can explain everything we discovered. Sarah nodded, her hands clasped in her lap. I need to know the whole truth. Henry opened the briefcase and pulled out a yellowed letter. This letter was written by Helen Johnson in March 1996, 2 days before she left the family business. Edward watched Sarah as she took the letter with trembling hands. The cursive and delicate handwriting was faded, but still legible. Do you want me to read it out loud, or? I can do it, Sarah replied, taking a deep breath before starting. Mr. Anthony, by the time you read this letter, I will have already left. I know you tried to do what you thought was right by offering me money to resolve the situation, but I cannot accept that my daughter grows up thinking she was a mistake. She is not a mistake, sir. She is the result of something that, even if brief, was true for me. I know you have a family, responsibilities, a position to maintain. Therefore, I ask for nothing more than what has already been offered, that you help ensure she is adopted by a good family. Betty Johnson is a wonderful woman who has always wanted a daughter. She will care for Sarah as if she were her own blood. I ask only one thing. If one day Sarah seeks her origins, please tell her that she was wanted and loved, even if for a short time, and tell her that she carries within her the intelligence and strength of the Johnsons, but I hope she also carries the compassion that I learned to value far from gilded halls. Helen. The silence that followed was profound. Sarah wiped the tears that fell silently, while Emily watched her with concern. Mommy is crying because the letter is sad, Emily asked, dropping her colored pencil. Edward crouched down beside the girl. Sometimes we cry when we discover important things. About our family, Emily. It's not bad sadness. It's like when you get emotional watching a beautiful movie. My daughter, Sarah said, pulling Emily close. Remember I told you that I was adopted by Grandma Betty when I was a baby? I remember. You said Grandma chose you to be her daughter. That's true. And today we discovered who my biological parents were. And you know something amazing. You have more family than we thought. Emily looked from Sarah to Edward, her quick mind connecting the dots. Does Edward belong to my family? Sarah hesitated, looking at Edward. He nodded encouragingly. Yes, my love. Edward is your uncle, your grandma's brother that I never met. Emily's eyes widened. So he's not my boss anymore. He's really my uncle. Edward felt his heart tighten. "Yes, Emily, I am your uncle." "Does that mean you will give me birthday presents and come to my school parties?" she asked with the devastating simplicity of children. "If you want, yes." Emily thought for a moment, then got up and walked over to Edward. "Can I give you an uncle hug?" Edward looked at Sarah, who nodded with a sad smile. When Emily hugged him, he felt as if a part of him that had been broken for decades finally fit into the right place. "Dr. Henry," Sarah said after a few moments, "is there anything else I need to know?" "Well," Henry adjusted his glasses, "there is a delicate matter regarding inheritance. Technically, as the biological daughter of Anthony Johnson, you would be entitled to a share of the family estate." Edward straightened up. "It's true. My grandfather left a will that made provisions for unrecognized children." Sarah turned pale again. I don't want anything. I didn't come here for money." "We know that," Edward said gently. "But it's your right. It's Emily's right." "No." Sarah shook her head vigorously. "I can't accept. It would be like I was taking advantage of the situation." "Sarah," Henry intervened, "may I make a suggestion? How about we create an educational fund for Emily, something that ensures her future but doesn't drastically change your lives right now?" Edward watched Sarah struggle with pride and pragmatism. He knew her well enough to know that she hated the idea of accepting what could seem like charity. "And what if," Edward said slowly, "instead of inheritance we consider this as back pay, 3 years of work for a salary that was below what you deserved?" "Edward." "Sarah, please, let me do this, not as a boss, not as a favor, as family taking care of family." Emily, who had been following the conversation attentively, suddenly said, "Mummy, remember you always say that when someone offers you help from a good heart, it's rude to refuse?" Sarah looked at her daughter, then at Edward. Are you sure you won't regret this? Won't it complicate things with your family, with the business? The only thing I would regret is letting you two face difficulties when I can help." Sarah closed her eyes for a long moment, then sighed. "All right, but with conditions. I want a formal contract. I want everything to be transparent and legal, and I will continue working." "Sarah, you don't need to." "I do, not for money, but because this house has become my home too, in a strange way, and because someone needs to take care of you." Edward smiled, the first genuine smile in days. "Okay, but as a family member, not as an employee. As the house manager," Sarah negotiated, "and curator of the art collection. Remember our conversation about that?" "Perfect." Dr. Henry closed the folder with satisfaction. "Well, I think we managed to turn a complicated situation into something constructive." After he left, the three were alone for the first time since the revelation. The silence was no longer tense, it was reflective. "Edward," Sarah finally said, "I'm sorry for reacting poorly this morning." "You reacted normally. I should have figured this out sooner." "Maybe things happened at the right time," she said, watching Emily organize her colored pencils with obsessive precision, a trait she had clearly inherited from the Johnsons. "If we had known from the start, maybe we wouldn't have developed this closeness." Edward understood what she wasn't saying. If they had known they were family, they might never have discovered that they genuinely cared for each other. "Sarah." "Yes?" "Thank you for giving me a real family." She smiled, and for the first time in days, the smile reached her eyes. "Thank you for accepting us into yours." November brought subtle but profound changes in the dynamics of the penthouse. Sarah now officially held the position of house manager and curator of the art collection, with a salary that reflected her true responsibilities. More importantly, She had moved in with Emily and Grandma Betty to the second guest room of the penthouse, transforming the space into a small family apartment within the larger house. Edward discovered that having a real family was completely different from what he had imagined. There was no longer absolute silence during meals. Emily was always asking questions about everything, from the paintings on the walls to the news in the newspaper. Sarah not only cooked, but had turned meals into moments of genuine togetherness. That Thursday morning, Edward woke up to the sound of laughter coming from the kitchen. As he approached, he found Emily sitting on the counter, helping Sarah prepare homemade French bread, both covered in flour from head to toe. "Uncle Edward!" Emily shouted upon seeing him, jumping off the counter to hug him, a ritual that had become sacred in recent weeks. "Look, Mommy is teaching me how to make bread just like Great-Grandma Helen used to." Edward looked at Sarah questioningly. "Great-Grandma Helen?" "I found some recipes in the belongings that Helen left," Sarah explained, a bit shyly. "Grandma Betty kept everything all these years, waiting for the day I would want to learn. I thought it would be nice to teach Emily some traditions from the biological family." Edward felt a strange emotion imagining his grandmother, whom he had barely known, passing down recipes to the secret daughter, who was now teaching them to the great-granddaughter. It was as if time had folded over itself, connecting generations that had never met. "Can I help?" he asked, surprising both of them. "You know how to cook?" Emily asked, incredulous. "No, but I can learn." The next 2 hours were a delicious chaos. Edward discovered that he had no knack for cooking, that Emily was a patient but strict teacher, and that Sarah had a contagious laugh when she completely relaxed. When they finally managed to take the breads out of the oven, only slightly burned, the three were covered in flour and smiling like children. "Now it looks like you all are a real family," Grandma Betty commented from the armchair in the living room, where she was knitting while watching the scene. At 67, she had surprisingly adapted well to the change, treating Edward not as a boss, but as an adoptive grandson who needed to learn to relax. "Grandma Betty," Edward said, approaching her, "can I ask you a personal question?" "Of course, my child. Did you always know that Sarah was special? How?" Grandma Betty smiled, lowering her knitting needles. "A mother feels these things, Edward. Sarah has always had a different intelligence, a sensitivity to art and beauty that didn't come from me or the late Joachim. And her eyes, those green eyes were identical to the woman in the old photo she carried. Did Helen leave photos? A few. I'll show them to you later if you want." That afternoon, Edward found himself sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by photo albums that told the story he had never known. Helen Johnson was truly beautiful. Not the artificial beauty of Claudia, but a natural beauty that radiated intelligence and kindness. In the photos with Anthony Johnson, there was a genuine intimacy that contrasted with the typical formality of the family. "She really loved your grandfather," Sarah said, sitting next to him. "From the letters I found, it wasn't just a fling, it was real love." "My grandfather never showed emotions," Edward commented, studying a photo where Anthony was smiling, something he had rarely seen in life. "But with her, he seems human." "Emily has his eyes," Sarah observed, "and that quiet determination. Yesterday she spent 3 hours trying to draw the school building with perfect perspective." Edward looked at Emily, who was on the floor organizing her colored pencils by shade. Another obsessively Johnson trait. "Is she adapting well to the new school?" Sarah had transferred Emily to a private school that offered specialized support for children with dyslexia, using part of the educational fund that Edward had insisted on creating. "Very well. The teacher said she has an exceptional talent for visual math, and she's making friends." Sarah smiled. "Including A little boy named Jacob that she says will marry when he grows up. Edward felt a strange pang in his chest. Marry? She's only 6 years old. Relax, Uncle Edward, Sarah laughed. It's just childhood love, very innocent. Still, are you already jealous? Just imagine when she's 15. Edward turned pale just thinking about it. Maybe I should hire security. Edward! Sarah playfully slapped his arm. You can't overprotect her like that. Why not? I'm the uncle. It's my job. Sarah looked at him with an amused expression. You've changed a lot, you know. 3 months ago you barely spoke to us. Now you're planning to hire security for a 6-year-old girl. Edward considered her observation. It was true. He had spent 45 years building walls around his heart, and in a matter of weeks, a little girl and her mother had torn them all down. You changed me, he admitted. Before I met you, I existed. Now I live. Sarah grew serious. Edward, can I ask you something about your scar? You never told us how it happened. Edward unconsciously touched the mark on his face. It was an automatic gesture he made hundreds of times a day. It was when I was 18, he said slowly. There was a fire in the building where my girlfriend at the time lived. I went in to try to save her. Did you succeed? Yes. She came out unscathed. I didn't have the same luck. A beam caught fire, fell, and hit me. Sarah was quiet for a moment. And her? Did you stay together afterward? Edward laughed bitterly. She broke up with me in the hospital. She said she couldn't look at me without remembering the trauma after 3 years together. Edward, I'm so sorry. That's when I learned that people don't see beyond the surface, and I decided it was safer to keep my distance. Sarah looked at him intently. You know that's not true, right? That there are people capable of seeing beyond scars. I know. Emily taught me that on the first day. And me? Sarah asked softly. What do you see when I look at you? Edward met her gaze, searching for any sign of pity or discomfort, but all he saw was affection, acceptance, family. I see someone who accepts me as I am. Exactly. And that's the difference between true love and superficial passion. In that moment, Edward understood that he had lost Sarah as a romantic interest, but gained something infinitely more valuable. A sister who loved him unconditionally, and a niece who saw in him not a marked man, but an uncle who made her feel safe. December arrived with the suffocating heat of summer in New York City, and a piece of news that shook the stability Edward had built with his new family. Dr. Henry called one Friday morning, his voice tense in a way Edward hadn't heard in years of friendship. Edward, I need you to come to the office immediately. There's a serious problem. What kind of problem? Claudia Anderson and her father are threatening to sue you for breach of marriage commitment. They claim there was a verbal marriage agreement, and your refusal is causing them millions in damages. Edward felt his stomach churn. That's ridiculous. There was never a formal commitment. I know, but they have witnesses willing to swear otherwise. And Edward, there's something else. They've found out about Sarah and Emily. Edward's blood ran cold. What do you mean? They're claiming you broke the commitment because you were having an affair with an employee. They have photos of the 3 of you on the penthouse balcony, looking like a family. They're threatening to make this public if you don't agree to pay a settlement. Edward hung up the phone with trembling hands. He looked around the living room, where Sarah was organizing some artwork that had arrived for cataloguing while Emily was quietly drawing at the dining table. The domestic peace that had become so precious was about to be shattered. Edward, Sarah noticed his pallor. Is something wrong? We need to talk. You, me, and Emily. Sarah sensed the gravity in his voice and called her daughter. The three of them sat on the sofa in the living room, Emily between the two adults, her green eyes sensing that something was wrong. "Remember I told you about Claudia? The woman my family wanted me to marry? The one who looks like a doll from a magazine?" Emily asked, making Sarah suppress a smile despite the tension. "That's the one. Well, she and her family are very angry because I didn't want to marry her, and now they're threatening." Edward hesitated, searching for the right words for a 6-year-old. "Threatening what?" Sarah asked, a note of fear in her voice. "They're going to try to tarnish our reputation, say that you two are, that our relationship is inappropriate." Sarah turned pale. "Edward, if this becomes a public scandal, I know. And there's more. They're demanding a multi-million-dollar settlement, or they'll sue the company." "How much?" $50 million, Sarah gasped. 50! Edward, that's a fortune. To them, it's extortion. To me, it's a price that might be worth paying to protect you both. "No!" Sarah stood up abruptly. "You can't give in to extortion because of us. We're leaving. Today." "Sarah." "No, Edward. I'm not going to let you destroy your life for us." Emily had been following the conversation with growing attention. Now she stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below with an expression too serious for her age. "Uncle Edward," she said without turning, "is the doll-like girl lying about you?" "Yes, Emily, she is. And she wants your money because she's angry." "Basically, yes." Emily turned around, her eyes shining with a determination that eerily resembled Anthony Johnson. "Then she's a bad person. And bad people shouldn't win against good people." "Sometimes life isn't that simple, my love," Sarah said softly. "But you've always taught me that when someone is being unfair, the people have to be brave and face it," Emily insisted. "Uncle Edward, are you going to let the doll-like girl win?" Edward looked at his niece, this extraordinary girl who had completely changed his life, and felt a determination grow within him. "You know what, Emily? You're right. I won't let that happen." "Edward," Sarah warned, "think carefully. 50 million, it's money. Just money." Edward stood up, grabbing the phone. "Dr. Henry, it's me. Schedule a meeting with Claudia and her father for this afternoon." "Edward, are you sure?" "Absolutely, and I want you to prepare some documents for me. Documents regarding the investigation we did on Claudia's background." On the other end of the line, Henry laughed. "Ah, you remembered that." "What investigation?" Sarah asked after he hung up. "Routine I do with anyone who approaches me with matrimonial interest, and we found some very interesting things about the Anderson family." 3 hours later, Edward was sitting in the conference room of the most prestigious law firm in New York City, staring at Claudia and Roberto Anderson. Claudia looked impeccable as always, but there was something desperate in her perfectly made-up eyes. Roberto, on the other hand, was sweating nervously despite trying to maintain an authoritative posture. "Edward," Roberto began, "we hope you came here to be reasonable." "I came here to put an end to this nonsense," Edward replied coldly. "Dr. Henry, can you show the documents?" Henry opened a folder and spread several photographs across the table. They were pictures of Claudia entering and leaving a hotel with a man who was definitely not Edward. "Claudia Anderson has been having an extramarital affair for over a year with Andrew Smith, son of Congressman Mark Smith," Edward said calmly. "In fact, there are records that she used credit cards in my name to finance romantic trips with him." Claudia's face lost all color. "Edward, I can explain." "You don't need to. There's more." Edward gestured to Henry, who spread other documents. "Roberto Anderson has gambling debts totaling $80 million, debts with very dangerous people who are demanding payment." Roberto abruptly stood up. "This is slander. It's a perfectly legal private investigation." Edward leaned back in his chair. Now I'm going to make a counter-proposal. You withdraw all accusations, disappear from my life, and I won't make this information public. Otherwise, in addition to suing you for blackmail, I will ensure that all of New York's high society knows exactly who you really are." The silence in the room was deafening. You wouldn't do that," Claudia whispered. "Try me," Edward replied, with a coldness that reminded everyone why he was feared in the business world. Roberto and Claudia exchanged desperate glances. They knew they had lost. "Fine," Roberto finally said. "We withdraw all accusations. And you never come near me, my family, or my business again." "Agreed." After they left, Edward remained seated for a few minutes, processing what had just happened. "Edward," Henry said, "can I give you a personal opinion?" "Sure." "In 20 years of friendship, I've never seen you fight for something with such determination. Sarah and Emily have truly changed you." Edward smiled, a genuine, liberated smile. "They gave me something worth fighting for, a real family." When he got home, he found Sarah and Emily anxiously waiting in the living room. "So what happened?" Sarah asked. "It's over. They withdrew everything." Emily ran to hug him. "You won against the doll-like girl." "We won," Edward corrected her, hugging Sarah too, "because a true family always wins." May 2025 arrived with that characteristic freshness of New York's spring that painted the city in golden and orange hues. Exactly 11 months had passed since a 6-year-old girl touched the scar of a lonely man, forever transforming 3 lives that intertwined unexpectedly. Edward woke up that Saturday morning to the familiar sound of laughter coming from the kitchen. As he headed there, he found a scene that had become routine but still moved him. Sarah and Emily preparing breakfast together, while Grandma Betty knitted in the armchair by the window, supervising everything with her serene smile. "Uncle Edward!" Emily ran to hug him, now a 7-year-old girl whose hair had finally agreed to stay in a braid. "Today is a special day." "And why is it special?" he asked, pretending not to know. "Because today is the anniversary of the day I touched your scar," she replied, beaming. "Mom said we can celebrate." Edward looked at Sarah, who smiled with that mix of shyness and affection that had become so familiar. In recent months, they had found a perfect balance, a family built not just by blood, but by love, respect, and mutual care. "And how are we going to celebrate?" Edward asked, sitting at the table where Grandma Betty had prepared a complete breakfast. "With a summer festival," Emily announced, clapping her hands. "On the rooftop. Mom said we can invite all my friends from the new school." Edward looked around the table, his true family. Sarah had flourished in recent months as the official curator of the collection, developing a detailed catalogue of the works and organizing small private exhibitions that impressed collectors and critics. Emily had adapted magnificently to her new school, where her learning differences were seen as special gifts, and Grandma Betty, at 67, had become the loving matriarch that Edward had never had. "A summer festival in May?" Edward questioned, amused. "It's early," Emily explained with the irrefutable logic of children, "because in June we will be busy with other important things." Edward exchanged a questioning glance with Sarah, who blushed slightly. "Emily," Sarah said, gently, "remember we talked about keeping secrets until the right time." "Oops." Emily covered her mouth with her hands, but her eyes sparkled with mischief. "What secret is that?" Edward insisted, curious. Sarah took a deep breath, then went to the living room shelf and returned, carrying a leather folder. "Actually, I was going to wait until after the party to tell you, but—" She opened the folder and pulled out several documents. "I was accepted into the master's program in art history at UCLA with a full scholarship." Edward was speechless for a moment, then a huge smile spread across his face. "Sarah, That's amazing. Congratulations. And that's not all, she continued, now speaking quickly as she did when she was nervous. The supervising professor was impressed with my cataloguing work of your collection. He wants me to develop my thesis on contemporary Brazilian art in private collections. Does that mean you're going to Los Angeles? Edward asked, feeling a pang of panic. Not necessarily. It's a hybrid program. I would need to go 1 week per month, but I can do the rest of the work from here. Edward stood up and hugged Sarah tightly. I am so proud of you. There's more, Emily interrupted, unable to contain her excitement. Tell him about the special project. Sarah laughed. Emily, you're terrible at keeping secrets. She turned to Edward. The professor was also impressed with Emily's drawings that I sent along with my application. He wants to include her in a research project on artistic perception in neurodivergent children. Edward looked at Emily, who was practically vibrating with joy. So you mean you're going to help Mum with the research? I'm going to draw famous artworks from memory, and they're going to study how my brain sees things. Emily explained. And the best part, I'm going to get a scholarship for visual arts. Grandma Betty put down her knitting and looked at Edward. See, I always said this girl was special, and Sarah too. They just needed an opportunity. Edward sat down again, processing all the news. His family was growing, evolving, achieving dreams, and he was part of it. You know, he said slowly, I have a proposal to make. Everyone looked at him expectantly. What if we turned part of the penthouse into an art studio, for Sarah to work on her thesis and for Emily to develop her talents? Edward, Sarah began, but he raised his hand. Let me finish. And how about we make it official? Create the Vasconcelos Institute of Contemporary Art, with Sarah as the curatorial director and Emily as our first scholarship recipient. The silence that followed was broken by Emily. Does that mean we're going to work together forever? If you want to, yes. Sarah had tears in her eyes. Edward, it's more than I ever dreamed. It's more than any of us dreamed, Grandma Betty added. When Betty Johnson adopted an orphaned baby girl 28 years ago, I never imagined she would become part of a family like the Vasconcelos. Edward looked around the table at these 3 women who had completely transformed his life. Actually, Grandma Betty, I think we became part of the Johnson Vasconcelos family. That afternoon, the rooftop of the penthouse was filled with children, colourful bunting, and summer festival music. Edward, who a year ago couldn't stand noise or disorder, found himself in the middle of the chaos, helping Emily organise games for her friends. Uncle Edward, one of Emily's friends asked, is it true that you're very rich? Edward looked at Sarah, who suppressed a smile, waiting to see how he would handle the question. You know. Edward knelt down to the girl's height. I used to think that having a lot of money made me rich. But I discovered that being surrounded by people who love me is what truly makes me rich. Oh, the girl nodded seriously. Then you really are rich, because Emily loves you so much. Edward felt his eyes fill with tears. It's true. I'm the richest man in the world. As the sun began to set, painting the New York City sky pink and orange, the party started to wind down. The children went home, Grandma Betty retired to rest, and Edward, Sarah, and Emily were left alone on the rooftop, watching the city light up below. Emily, Edward said, can I ask you a question? Sure. On that first day when you touched my scar, why did you do that? Emily thought for a moment, with that seriousness that sometimes made her seem much older. Because you looked sad. And Mum always says that when someone is sad we have to show kindness. And now, do I still look sad? Emily studied him carefully, then smiled. Now you look happy, like complete. Edward looked at his scar, reflected in the window glass. For the first time in 27 years, He didn't see it as a mark of difference or inadequacy. He saw it as what Emily had said on the first day, the place where an angel had kissed him to make him stronger. "Sarah," he said, "thank you." "Why?" "For teaching me that family isn't about sharing the same blood. It's about choosing to stay, choosing to love, choosing to build something beautiful together." Sarah smiled, wrapping her arm around Emily's shoulders. "Thank you for choosing us too." "Always," Edward replied. "Forever." Emily moved closer to Edward, and for the 100th time since that first day, gently touched his scar. But now, instead of whispering about angels, she said, "Dad, your scar is beautiful because it gave me a family." Edward had spent 45 years building walls around his heart, convinced it was safer to be alone. A 6-year-old girl tore them all down with a single touch, teaching him that the marks we carry are not signs of weakness, but proof of our ability to survive, grow, and love. As he watched New York City shine in the approaching night, with Sarah and Emily by his side, Edward knew he had finally come home, not to the address listed on his documents, but to the place where he belonged, in the heart of a family that chose to love unconditionally. The scar that once was his curse had become his greatest blessing because it brought him to the love of an extraordinary girl and her equally special mom. And in the quiet nights that would come, Edward would still touch the scar on his face, but now with gratitude, always. Remembering Emily's words, "Scars are the places where angels kiss us to make us stronger." Please give a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and if you watched until here, comment, "I watched until here," and share your opinion about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that appears on the final screen. It's very exciting.